Pedro opened the eyes when feeling the trembling of his brother. I didn't understand why we're there, nor why the shiny black car had simply disappeared. Juan, with his cheeks wet and bare feet, clung to him like would make his favorite blanket at home. But there was no blanket, no house, no father, only the cutting cold of the early morning and a huge forest that seemed look at them in silence. They both knew they had to stay still, his father had ordered. "Don't move," he said with a voice that brooked no questions, before closing the door from the car and walk away without looking back. No one there was cried then. The crying came after, when the engine died in the distance and silence fell on top of him like a slab. Since the trees, some eyes dark and bright that they watched. The horse white was not an illusion, although it seemed. His fur shone with the dim light of the moon, as if carrying with it the last hope of the world. He didn't neigh. He didn't run. He just walked slowly until he was standing in front of the children. John stepped back, scared, but Peter stretched the trembling hand. Snow, as they would call after, bowed the head with softness, allowing the child graze his snout. It was warm, alive, real. In that moment, without words, neither promises, was formed a lasso. The horse crouched down, almost as if inviting them up, and with slow movements, both children they finished supported in his back. Snow gave average, turned, and walked toward the forest. Nobody them taught to trust in he, just him they did, because in a world that there was betrayed, that silent being seemed the only truth. Joaquín Torres did not expect to visit this night. At 68, he lived alone in his wooden cabin on the edge of the forest with a deaf dog and a rooster that no longer crowed. He had learned to live with loneliness after his wife passed away and his son moved to the city, taking with him all of Joaquín's remaining enthusiasm. When he heard the horse's footsteps outside, he thought it was just Nieve, his old companion who sometimes disappeared for days at a time to roam free. But when he opened the door, he froze. Nieve was there, yes, but not alone. On the animal's back, two small children, covered in leaves and shivering with cold, were looking at him with large, fearful eyes. For a moment, Joaquín thought it was a vision, but the fear in the children's eyes was too real to be. Imagination. Without thinking, he ran to them, wrapped them both in the blanket he had over his shoulders, and carried them inside. He lit the fire, warmed the milk, and cut the bread with trembling hands. The boys didn't say a word. They just ate in silence, without letting go of each other. Joaquín felt a lump in his throat. Those children hadn't appeared there by chance, and Nieve had never done anything like this before. It was as if the horse knew exactly what to do, as if he'd been guided by something higher up. As the little ones slept on the couch, curled up under heavy blankets, he stroked the animal's neck and murmured, "Thank you, friend." For the first time in many years, he felt something different in his chest. It wasn't sadness, it was purpose. Have you ever experienced something like this? Comment below. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. The next morning, the sun had barely touched the fields when Joaquín left for the city. He needed to notify the authorities, but something inside him hesitated. He didn't know whether to go to the police station or directly to the church. He chose the latter. He found Father Antonio sweeping leaves from the driveway, as he did every Friday. He told him what had happened the night before, every detail, not omitting Nieve's almost magical presence. The priest listened in silence, frowning with concern. "Bring them here," he finally said, "but don't tell anyone yet. This has to be done carefully." Joaquín nodded. There was something in the priest's tone that seemed to predict a storm. These boys weren't just lost children. They were the beginning of something much bigger. Meanwhile, across town, Roberto Mendoza was peacefully enjoying his coffee. He had slept well. After months of planning every step, the plan had been executed perfectly. No witnesses, no trace. The boys had been abandoned in the middle of nowhere, just as they had wanted. Their mother, Clara, would never know what really happened. For all intents and purposes, he was on a business trip. He was an important man, surrounded by lawyers, lobbyists, and a silent wife who never asked questions. But contrary to what he imagined, something had gone wrong. Snow wasn't part of the plan. No one expected a white horse in the middle of the woods, even less so with a lonely old man who had unwittingly jeopardized all the secrets Roberto had been burying for years. Clara Mendoza woke up with a start that Saturday. She had dreamed of her children, as always. In the dream, Pedro showed her a blue flower he had found in the woods, and Juan laughed, covered in mud up to his knees. She woke up smiling, but the smile faded when she saw the empty bed beside her. Roberto had left early, as usual. Since the twins were born, her husband had become increasingly absent, always busy, always with urgent meetings. And now the boys had been with him for days, supposedly traveling to visit a client's farm. Clara felt a tightness in her chest. She couldn't explain. She picked up her cell phone to call, but the call went straight to voicemail. Something was wrong, very wrong, and deep down, she knew it, because a mother feels before she knows. At the parish house, Father Antonio prepared the back room to receive the little ones. He placed mattresses on the floor, along with clean sheets and toys donated by the faithful. Joaquín arrived with the boys shortly after noon. Pedro was more alert, observing everything around him. Juan was still sleeping, clinging to the old man's arm. The priest welcomed them with a warm smile and teary eyes. He placed his hand over both of their heads and said, "You are safe now." Neither of them responded, but Pedro approached Nieve, who was still waiting outside, and kissed her on the nose. It was as if he were saying thank you in a language only the two of them understood. The priest watched this with a shudder. The story was just beginning, and already there was more faith in that gesture than in many of his homilies. Elena Suarez was reviewing the papers piled on her desk when she received the note from Father Antonio. The prosecutor had known the old man for years and knew he only came to her when it was truly urgent. She read the few handwritten lines and left everything. 20 minutes later, I parked in front of the parish church. As I entered, she saw the twins playing with wooden blocks under Joaquín's protective gaze. Neither of them seemed to say much, but their eyes spoke volumes. Elena knelt before them and, in a soft voice, asked their names. Pedro answered first in a whisper. Juan simply leaned against his brother. "Someone left them," Joaquín said from across the room, "and it was Nieve who brought them to me." The prosecutor frowned. He knew Nieve by sight, but he had never seen him act like this. He wrote everything down in his notebook, including the horse's name. Meanwhile, Roberto answered a call in his luxurious penthouse. It was the lawyer. Something about strange movement in the area where he'd been days earlier. "Could someone have found the boys?" he asked, trying to maintain a calm tone. The lawyer hesitated for a moment and then replied, "We don't know yet, but I recommend you stay discreet for a while." Roberto hung up without saying thank you. He paced around the apartment in silence, then poured himself a whiskey and stared at his own reflection in the mirror. For the first time, he felt a pang of doubt. He was sure he'd planned everything perfectly, but things were getting out of hand. And absurdly, I felt like the enemy was an animal, a white horse, a damned horse that should never have appeared. Late in the afternoon, Clara went to the local police station. Her heart pounding, she insisted on speaking to someone in the juvenile department. The attendant, apathetic, asked her to wait. 40 minutes passed before a young police officer attended to her, looking at her as if she were a hysterical mother. "There, with their father, Mom. He has joint custody. Maybe he just doesn't have a signal." Clara tried to explain that something was wrong, that the boys hadn't called or texted her, that Roberto had been acting strangely for the past few months. The officer nodded, but did nothing. Back in the car, Clara cried silently. She took out her cell phone, looked at the photos of her children, and promised herself she wouldn't rest until she found them. She knew it wasn't just a hunch. It was certain. Something terrible had happened. Meanwhile, Pedro and Juan ate hot soup next to Joaquín under the soft light of the parish hall. The food was simple, but to them it felt like a feast. It was the first time they'd eaten seated at the table since their father left. Pedro looked at Joaquín with silent admiration. Juan, more shy, didn't let go of his brother's hand. Elena watched everything from a corner of the room, taking notes and making discreet connections. She'd already requested a review of the area's security cameras and authorized a DNA analysis if necessary, but something told her these children were the children of someone important, the kind of people who'd go to great lengths to keep up appearances, the kind of people who'd hide their children if it threatened their public image. And that's why Elena knew she'd have enemies as soon as this case came to light. Maria Luque first saw the news in a group message she shared with former co-workers. It was a small, almost unnoticed headline: 2 children found alone in rural area, case under investigation. But the accompanying image was clear. Even in low resolution, she recognized the golden curls and the frightened eyes. She dropped the phone and covered her mouth with her hands. She knew who they were, and worse, she knew who had left them there. Maria had worked for almost 7 years at Roberto Mendoza's house. She had been the twins' nanny until she was abruptly fired months earlier under the pretext of cost cuts. The truth was different. She had discovered too much. She knew about the betrayals, the bribes, the second family Roberto secretly supported. She knew that Clara had no idea about half the life her husband led. Tormented by guilt, Maria decided to seek out Father Antonio. She arrived at the church late in the afternoon, her face pale and her eyes red. "I was their nanny," she said before even sitting down. The priest didn't seem surprised. He listened silently as she told him everything. Roberto's screams, the children's fear, the coldness with which she spoke of Clara. "He's a dangerous man," Maria said, her voice breaking. "And now he's trying to erase what he considers a mistake." The priest took her hands and replied, "Then let's stop him." It was the first time in years that Maria felt her pain wasn't being ignored. That night, she left the church determined. She wouldn't allow those boys to return to the shadows. And if anyone had to fall, it would be the man who abandoned them without looking back. Elena called an urgent meeting with the district juvenile court judge. She presented the information gathered so far, including Maria's story, images of the children, and a preliminary report from the social worker who evaluated them. "They don't want to go back to their father," the prosecutor stated firmly, "and there are clear signs of neglect and abandonment." The judge, a bald man with a skeptical look, frowned. "Are you sure this isn't a heated family dispute?" Elena suppressed her irritation. She knew many viewed cases like this with disdain, but here the evidence spoke for itself. "I'm sure, and I want an immediate protection order. They need legal protection." After a few minutes of silence, the judge signed the document. They were protected, for now. At the parish, Clara finally managed to speak to the priest. Desperate, guided by rumors she had heard from mothers' groups in the region, she went to church with a photo of her children in her hands. She was trembling. When Father Antonio saw her, he understood everything. "They're here," he said with a smile. "They're safe." Clara burst into tears. When she entered the back room and saw Pedro and Juan sleeping side by side, the world seemed to slowly spin. She approached quietly and touched Pedro's hair. He slowly opened his eyes, looked at her and whispered, "Mommy." Clara fell to her knees and hugged them as if she wanted to press them against her chest again. Juan woke up to her crying and also threw himself into her arms. It was the reunion she had dreamed of for nights, but never imagined it would happen like this, surrounded by candles, silence, and the serene gaze of a white horse standing in the doorway. The reunion between Clara and her children spread quickly among those involved. Elena arrived minutes later, and upon seeing the scene, she breathed a sigh of relief. But the work was far from over. They had to act quickly, as rumors were already circulating that Roberto Mendoza had discovered the children's whereabouts. He'll try to reverse this. He'll use the best lawyers, the press, everything at his disposal, Elena warned. Clara nodded, still hugging the children. "I'm ready. I won't leave them again." Joaquín, who had been watching everything from afar, approached timidly. "Do you have a place to stay?" Clara shook her head. Then stay at my house. It's simple, but safe. No one questioned it. In that moment, the old man had become family. In Joaquín's simple house, Pedro and Juan rediscovered something they hadn't even known existed, a loving routine. They played with branches in the yard, helped feed the chickens, and fell asleep at night to the sound of the old man's out-of-tune guitar. Clara watched them with tears in her eyes, feeling like she was also relearning how to be a mother. Not for lack of love, but because for years she had lived imprisoned in a marriage where her desires had no voice. Now, far from luxury and oppression, she could hear her children's laughter without guilt. On any given Sunday, the three of them slept in the same bed, cuddled together, and it was there that Clara was certain, even if she lost everything again, she would fight to the end to never be separated from them again. Meanwhile, Nieve remained nearby, like a silent guardian. She lay under the mango tree next to the house, watching the children from a distance and, from time to time, gently pushing the door with her nose to check if they were okay. Joaquín used to say that horse was not of this world, and no one dared contradict him. One cold night, Pedro had a nightmare. He screamed for help. Nieve, who was sleeping in the grass, neighed loudly, waking everyone in the house. When Clara arrived in the room, she found her son crying, pointing toward the window. "The horse saved me, Mom. It woke me up." From that day on, no one doubted. Nieve was more than an animal. It was a bond, a symbol that even in the greatest darkness, something pure can emerge to guide the lost back to love. Elena gathered evidence for weeks. She declared Maria a key witness, requested authorized wiretaps, and gained access to bank records that revealed suspicious transfers made by Roberto. She even discovered a rural property in the name of a front man, the same location where his car was seen shortly before the children were abandoned. The prosecutor knew she was facing an opponent with almost unlimited resources, but she also knew she now had powerful allies, the truth, and an entire community willing to protect her. When she filed the request for indictment for abandonment of a disabled person, corruption, and document fraud, the judge hesitated. "Are you aware that this could ruin many people's careers?" he asked. Elena replied without flinching, "If this is her career, maybe it really should be ruined." News of the lawsuit against Roberto Mendoza spread quickly. Headlines began to appear. Prestigious businessman accused of abandoning his twin sons. The press, once flattering, now smelled blood, and it was there that Roberto realized what he feared most: losing control of the narrative. Until then, he decided what would be said, how, and who would say it. Now the story was in the hands of the public. He tried to get ahead of events. He paid for interviews, manipulated versions, hired image experts, but nothing worked, because people didn't just see a complaint. They saw the boy's eyes in the photographs. They saw the white horse. They saw a symbol. Nieve appeared in every article as the magical creature who had saved the twins. And although it seemed naive, it was this purity that triumphed. Against this, all the money in the world wasn't enough. Snow's saddle when he was surprised by a group of journalists on his property. They wanted pictures of the horse, interviews, emotional statements. He refused it all. "Snow is not a circus attraction," he said. Still, the animal's image spread across the internet. Children drew pictures of the white horse in schools. Churches cited the miracle of its appearance in sermons. Snow had become a symbol of hope, and yet he continued to graze peacefully, not understanding the commotion. Peter and John, for their part, were agitated. They knew something important was coming, even if no one spoke clearly. "Are we going to have to go back to Daddy's house?" John asked one evening. Clara hugged him tightly and replied, "Never again, my love, never again." The day of the hearing arrived. Clara entered holding her children's hands, escorted by Elena and the juvenile court lawyer. Roberto, wearing a business suit, smiled at the cameras as if it were just another business meeting. But inside, he was burning. As he watched the boys enter the court, his face hardened. Pedro looked away. Juan hid behind his mother. Witnesses were heard. Psychological reports, financial records, videos and messages were presented. The prosecution built a solid case, supported by evidence and Maria's moving account. But it was Pedro's testimony that changed everything. With a trembling voice and his gaze fixed on the judge, he said, "He abandoned us. The horse saved us." The room fell silent. Not even Roberto had an answer for that. After Pedro's testimony, the judge called a recess. The impact of the testimony was evident. No legal argument could stand up to the simplicity of that truth spoken by a child. Elena took the opportunity to reinforce with Clara that regardless of the outcome, they had already won an important part. The boys were alive, protected, and the entire country knew it. Outside, a crowd gathered with signs reading, "Justice for the boys," "Twins and snow taught us he the way," children riding toy horses, women wearing t-shirts with the silhouette of a white horse. No one expected that, not even Clara. That wasn't just her fight. It was the fight of all those who had ever been ignored, discredited, or discarded. When the session resumed, the judge announced the decision in a firm voice. Temporary custody of the children would be granted to the mother under the protection of the state. Roberto Mendoza would be formally investigated for abandonment of a disabled person, ideological falsehood, and obstruction of justice. The court also ordered him to maintain a minimum distance of 500 meters from his children and those involved in the case. The decision was greeted with tears, hugs, and a long collective sigh. Roberto left silently, escorted without looking back. For the first time, there was no press crew waiting to applaud him. Only the shadow of the man who had once believed he controlled everything. Pedro, seeing him pass, grabbed Joaquín's arm. "He can't handle us anymore, can he?" And the old man responded with a smile, "No, son. Now we're the ones taking care of you." In the days following the trial, the twins' story continued to spread like wildfire. Television channels requested interviews with Clara, Elena, Joaquín, and even the judge. Everyone refused. The priority now was to protect the children. But something curious began to happen. Schools, child protection organizations, and even authorities in other states began requesting talks, bills, and collaborations inspired by the Nieve case. The horse has become a national symbol of child protection. Statues began to be commissioned. A campaign was created with the slogan, "Every child deserves a snow horse." And although those involved hadn't planned any of this, they understood it was a unique opportunity to turn grief into action. Clara, along with her children, decided not to return to the big city. They stayed in the countryside, living in Joaquín's house, who was now officially the children's grandfather, although not by blood. Maria returned to visit them frequently, and little by little rebuilt her role as a caregiver with love and respect. Elena was promoted to the prosecutor's office and continued working on children and youth cases, using the experience as a personal and professional milestone. And Nieve remained the same, grazing, galloping, watching the twins from a distance as always. But now, in addition to being a guardian, he was also a legend. Children from all over came to meet him. Some cried when they saw him, others simply watched him in silence, like someone contemplating a living miracle. And he, without fully understanding his role, remained the same, a horse who only did what his heart told him. One morning, Pedro asked Clara if he could write a letter to Nieve. She smiled and took out paper and pencil. The boy, still using crooked handwriting and short sentences, wrote, "Thank you for not leaving us alone. I love you a lot." Then, with Joaquín's help, he fixed the note to the fence, near where the horse usually rested its muzzle. Meanwhile, in a luxurious but quiet apartment, Roberto Mendoza watched the news with the sound turned off. Images of Clara, smiling with her children, of Nieve among the children, of posters with phrases like "Justice won." None of it moved him, or perhaps it hurt too much to admit. The lawyers had appealed the ruling, but they already knew it would be difficult to reverse. Roberto's public image was ruined. His businesses began to suffer boycotts. Former allies had distanced themselves, and for the first time in a long time, he was alone. He tried to blame everyone: Clara, the children, the priest, old Joaquín, even the horse. But deep down, he knew he had destroyed himself with his own hands, because when he chose power over family, he didn't foresee that a pure heart, even that of an animal, could bring down his empire. As the months passed, the twins blossomed. Juan began to talk more, ask questions, and draw horses in all their notebooks. Pedro learned to read with the help of Clara and Joaquín, sitting in the shade of a tree while Nieve grazed nearby. The simple routine became home. There were difficult days, of course, nightmares, homesickness, hazy memories, but there was always someone there to hold them. An invisible web had formed around them, made up of ordinary people, neighbors, former strangers who decided to care together. In every part of that story, there was someone who chose to do the right thing, even if they were afraid. And that, Clara now understood, was what saved the world. Small acts of courage. Nieve, in turn, had become a part of everyone's life. When the children were sad, he was the one who made them smile. When Clara felt exhausted, all she needed was to see him lying in the sun, to remember that there was beauty in simple things. And Joaquín had found in Pedro and Juan the joy he had lost when his son left. Once, as he watched them running through the grass, he whispered to himself, "This is what I needed." No one called him Mr. Joaquín anymore. Now it was Grandpa. The house was filled with color, laughter, the smell of cake, drawings on the walls, and toys scattered everywhere. But above all, it made sense, because everything that had begun with cowardly wickedness now ended as a rebuilt home, full of true bonds. One day, Elena returned to Joaquín's house. She had a proposal to transform that symbolic and welcoming space into a small foundation focused on providing emergency care to at-risk children. We can start with just a few rooms and a minimal staff, but the most important thing is already here: true love and care. Clara, initially surprised, accepted without hesitation. Joaquín, moved, said he never imagined ending his life helping others start over. Thus was born the foundation. Snow, with the white horse as its symbol printed on a wooden sign at the entrance. And even without understanding it, Snow seemed to grasp its meaning. She whinnied loudly on opening day, as if giving her blessing to her new life's mission. The impact was immediate. Donations poured in from all over the country. Volunteers stepped forward: psychologists, educators, veterinarians. The once silent house became a refuge for voices, stories, and reconstructions. Pedro and Juan helped with simple tasks, and Clara began coordinating care with the serenity of someone who has known despair and survived it. Nieve received extra carrots and visits from children who just wanted to touch him, as if that gesture conveyed something magical. One day, an 8-year-old girl, newly arrived at the shelter, put her face in his neck and said, "You understand me, right?" And everyone there knew it was true, because Nieve didn't need to speak. It was enough to be. She had saved Pedro and Juan, and now she was helping to save many others. Clara was invited to tell her story at a national conference on justice and family. She walked onto the stage with tears in her eyes, wearing a brooch in the shape of a white horse. She told it all, from the day she realized her children were missing to the moment she found them. Again, in Joaquín's arms, she spoke of guilt, of the strength she found when no one believed in her, and of the quiet faith she felt every time she looked at Nieve. At the end, the audience stood to applaud, but it wasn't just for her. It was for all the mothers who had been silenced, for all the children saved, for all those who needed a new beginning. That day, Clara wasn't just a survivor. She was the voice of many. The foundation Nieve grew slowly, but with deep roots. Within a year, she had already welcomed 23 children, each with a different story, but all marked by the same pain, abandonment. Some stayed for months, others for weeks, until they were placed with adoptive families or returned to safe homes. But while they were there, they were treated with respect, affection, and dignity. Pedro and Juan, now 5 years old, have become the home's little ambassadors. They introduced the new children to the spaces, showed them where the toys were, and explained that if you're scared, at night you can hug Nieve. He understands everything. There was no trauma that couldn't be soothed by that horse with his calm gaze and firm gait. One afternoon, Joaquín sat next to Elena on the porch of their home, both watching the children play in the yard. "I never imagined experiencing something like this at the end of my life," he said in a low voice with a tired smile. Elena, who was already preparing to officially close the case, responded, "You saved more than you know, Joaquín. Not just the children, but everyone." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the laughter in the distance. A light wind blew, causing the wooden plaque bearing the foundation's name to sway. Nieve grazed in the background, attentive, as always. And in that moment they both understood that what had begun as a personal tragedy had become a collective legacy, a living response to abandonment, the constant, silent, and unwavering presence of love. Over time, the story of the twins and the white horse began to be told in schools, children's books, and even plays. It was no longer just a court case or a sensational story. It was a modern fable, vivid and real, about courage, redemption, and unbreakable bonds. Professors use this example to talk about empathy. Young psychologists cited it in their lectures, and Clara, always discreet, continued to care for the foundation with the same serenity of someone who understands, deep down, that rebuilding is more difficult than starting from scratch, but infinitely more powerful. Peter and John grew up knowing they had been saved not just by an animal, but by a chain of human decisions made from the heart. Nieve was slowly aging. He no longer ran with the same agility, but he maintained his proud posture and his guardian routine. It was common to see him standing in front of the fence while the children played, as if overseeing their joy. One day, Juan asked Joaquín, "Grandpa, will Nieve live forever?" The old man hugged him tightly. Before answering, "In the hearts of everyone here, yes." The answer satisfied the boy, who ran back to the yard with a faint smile. Joaquín, however, stood there, looking at the horse with teary eyes. Did you know that time passes for everyone, even for wingless angels? But he also knew that certain beings don't disappear. They become part of everything that comes after. The following fall, Nieve fell ill. At first, nothing serious happened. He walked more slowly, had a decreased appetite, and spent long periods lying in the sun. But the veterinarians consulted were unanimous. It was age. A heart that has experienced so much love and devotion also tires. Clara organized a symbolic farewell, even though she didn't know how much time was left. The children drew pictures of him, wrote notes, and hung ribbons on trees. Peter and John slept 3 nights in a row next to the stable. "I don't want him to leave without us knowing how much we love him," Peter said in a broken voice. And Nieve, even weaker, raised her head every time the children arrived, as if she recognized their love by its scent. When the day finally came when Nieve stopped getting up, the whole house fell silent. Joaquín found him lying down, his eyes closed and his body serene. It seemed as if he were just sleeping. The kids came running, and upon seeing the scene, they hugged each other without saying anything. Clara fell to her knees and cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. Elena appeared later, and everyone held a small wake in the field, with flowers, little letters, and a simple wooden cross that read, "Here rests Nieve, the guardian of the forgotten." There were no speeches, just presence. And it was the presence of each person, children, adults, grateful hearts, that made that moment a ceremony of gratitude, not of sorrow. If you feel something while reading this, maybe it's time to move on. The story continues. Nieve's absence was felt by all, not as a void, but as a different, gentler presence diffused in the details. Pedro began to care for the plants in the garden with the same care with which he brushed the horse's coat. Juan began to draw him in all his notebooks, always with wings, as if he wanted to assure them that the guardian of the forgotten would now fly around, watching over other children. Joaquín, silently, left a carrot next to the cross in the field every week. It was his way of continuing the conversation with the friend who had given him so much in return. One night, Clara wrote Nieve a letter. She didn't read it aloud. She simply folded it and buried it under the mango tree, as if trusting that he would hear her from somewhere. Nieve's story became part of the welcoming ritual for new children. Every time someone new arrived scared, Pedro would tell the story of the white horse that appeared in the middle of the forest and saved 2 children who were cold. And then he showed me its photo, framed in the main room. The newcomers' expressions changed. Some were crying, others smiled, but they all understood, because in that house where so many scars had been found, there was now a secure foundation, the certainty that even when all seems lost, something or someone can appear and change everything. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's a gesture, and sometimes it's a white horse named Nieve. Over time, the Foundation Nieve became a national benchmark. Other shelters began to follow the same model: love before structure, connection before bureaucracy. Clara was invited to give talks at universities, Joaquín received letters from children across the country, and Eleanor was honored for her courage. But no recognition was more important than the daily life lived there. The first laugh from a child who hadn't laughed in weeks, the first spontaneous hug, the first thank you, said with sincerity. It was in those moments that everyone remembered why they started, not to win awards or headlines, but to ensure that no one else was left helpless, waiting for something that seemed to never arrive. One spring afternoon, as Juan and Pedro played in the yard with other children, Clara watched from the porch holding a cup of tea. Maria sat beside her smiling. "Have you ever thought about writing a book about all this?" he asked. Clara laughed. "I think the story is already being written, every day." And it was true. Every gesture in that house was a page. Every child welcomes a new chapter. Every memory of Nieve, a living line etched in everyone's memory. The white horse, which appeared like a miracle on a deserted road, now lived on in the trail it left, a legacy of protection, care, and unconditional love. And as long as someone remembered this, Nieve would never be forgotten. Nieve's death, a ceremony was held in her honor. It wasn't anything grand, just a gathering in the countryside with Clara, Joaquín, Elena, Maria, the children and all the children who had passed through the foundation. Pedro gave a short speech, written with the help of his mother. "Thank you, Nieve, for not having words but yes, heart, because we are not human, but we are taught to be better." Juan held a white flower and with teary eyes said, "I dream of you." Yesterday, Stabus running, free. The silence that followed said it all. Each person left a stone decorated with messages around the wooden cross. It was a circle of memories, love and gratitude that formed around the place where that horse had decided to rest forever. That night, Clara sat on the edge of her children's bed, as she did every night. Pedro slept peacefully, a book about horses open beside him. Juan looked up at the ceiling, thoughtful. "Mommy, do you think Nieve knew we needed him?" Clara smiled, moved. "I think he knew things we didn't understand yet." Juan closed his eyes and whispered, "He was our angel, wasn't he?" And Clara replied with the certainty of someone who has seen miracles before her own eyes. "Yes, my love, the most beautiful angel who ever lived." Outside, the night breeze passed through the trees, gently rustling the leaves, and for a moment, it was as if the sound of a light trot echoed across the countryside. It wasn't an invention, it was a vivid memory. Over the years, the story of Nieve and the twins became part of the town's identity. Tourists came to visit the foundation, see the cross in the field, and take photos with the colorful murals painted by the children. But residents knew that the true value of that story wasn't in the walls or the memories. It was in the way everyone had learned to care for others. Merchants donated food, neighbors offered transportation, and teachers volunteered tutoring. It was as if Nieve had left a seed inside each of them, and that seed grew into generosity, empathy, community. Pedro and Juan grew up with their feet on the ground and their hearts in heaven. They knew exactly what they had experienced, but they also knew what they had built from it. They weren't victims. They were survivors, builders of a new way of living. And it all began that cold night on the asphalt when two barefoot children were saved by a white horse. They told this story with pride, not to boast, but to remind us that no one is truly alone, even when all seems lost. Sometimes life leaves you in the middle of nowhere, Pedro told a group of young children. And then, out of nowhere, someone appears. It could be a horse, a person, a coincidence, and that changes everything. Juan added, "Snow saved us, but it was the love of all of you that made us grow." Once, during a conversation at the foundation, a 6-year-old girl asked Clara, "Do you believe in magic?" Clara thought for a moment before answering, "I believe, but not like in the movies. I believe in the magic of finding someone at just the right moment, in the magic of a healing hug, in how Nieve appeared when we needed her most." The girl smiled, satisfied with the answer, and ran off to play. That was the true legacy of all this, not turning pain into a spectacle, but into shared wisdom. Every scar was now a lesson, every tear a bridge. And Nieve's presence, though invisible, continued to mark every gesture in that house full of reborn stories. Elena, now grey-haired and with a new position in Brasilia, returned to the foundation years later, without warning. She was greeted with hugs, shouts, and letters. Pedro, now a teenager, guided her through the halls and showed her the new facilities: library, music room, community garden. "We didn't stop, Aunt Elena. We just changed phases." She smiled, moved. On her way out, she left an envelope with an anonymous donation and a message, "So that light never lacks where there was darkness." Before leaving, she passed by the snow cross. She touched the wood, closed her eyes, and gave thanks. Not for a solved case, but for having been part of something that transformed destinies. A white horse, a child, with sad eyes, a doubting mother, all united by a force that not even the law could explain. The love that persists, the love that remains. Snow's story. It was a symbolic moment, but a deeply transformative one. It wasn't about idolizing an animal, but about recognizing the quiet courage it represented. Peter and John, now older, followed everything with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. They knew the legend was a living part of who they had become. And more than that, they knew the true power of the story wasn't in the horse itself, but in the way it brought out the best in the people around it. With each reading, someone was moved. With each tear, a new cycle of healing began. On one of those birthdays, Joaquín couldn't get out of bed. He'd been weak for weeks, but he never complained. Clara sat down beside him and took his hand. "They'll keep going, you know," she said, "even when we're no longer here." Joaquín smiled with an effort. "I know, because they learned from Nieve and from us." Late in the afternoon, Juan brought him a notebook with drawings made by the children. "So you can take it with you, Grandpa, when you go for a walk in the clouds." Joaquín held the gift with trembling hands and replied, "Then I'll take a piece from each of you." The next day he departed in peace. And at the foundation, everyone knew he had gained wings, perhaps the same ones that Juan always saw on the white horse in his dreams. Joaquín's death felt like the loss of a deep root. For days, the foundation remained respectfully silent. Clara organized a simple ceremony, just as he would have wanted, with children reading messages and planting a tree in the field where Nieve once stood. "Now we have two presences here," Peter said, looking up at the sky. "Two guardians. The tree bore Joaquín's name, and a plaque next to it read, "Here grows the love that is seed." It was impossible to pass by without feeling something in your chest. Each leaf swaying in the wind seemed to whisper a piece of advice from the old rancher who, without asking anything in return, tenderly and firmly brought two children back into the world. Life went on. The foundation welcomed new volunteers, expanded its classrooms, and began to establish partnerships with universities. Pedro was interested in psychology and Juan in the arts. Clara continued as director, but was already beginning to prepare her children to lead the project's future. Maria coordinated the educational side with the same care as always. Everything there vibrated with life. The story of the twins, of Nieve, of Joaquín, was told by others but never forgotten. It was passed on like a treasure, adapted for each listener, but with a truth that no one dared to change. When the world fails you, there may still be a white horse, a gesture, a heart willing to love. And this could be the beginning of everything. During one of the many school visits to the foundation, a teacher asked Pedro if he thought everything they had experienced could have been avoided. He thought for a few seconds and calmly replied, "Maybe so, but if it hadn't happened, we wouldn't have met Nieve, or Grandpa Joaquín, or you." That resonated in the teacher's mind for days. It was impossible not to think about the losses, but it was also impossible to ignore the achievements that came afterward. The twins' story left a clear message. It's not about what they do to you, but what you do with it. And Pedro, now a teenager, was living proof that pain can become a bridge, that the wound, if embraced, can become a cure for many others. Snow's story. Written by Clara and illustrated by Juan, the project was distributed free of charge in public schools, community libraries, and reception centers. The title was simple: The Horse That Didn't Speak, But Did. I Said It All. Children across the country learned about the white horse that saved two children and inspired a quiet revolution. In many classrooms, the book was read as a final semester activity, followed by discussions about empathy, abandonment, love, and courage. Years later, with the foundation already consolidated and her children grown, Clara decided to pay one last tribute to Nieve. In the field where he was buried, with Joaquín's tree next to it, a life-size sculpture of the white horse was erected, made of wood and recycled iron, built by young people from the foundation itself. The sculpture wasn't perfect, but it had a soul. It represented not only the animal, but everything it stood for: presence, welcome, instinct, courage. The unveiling was attended by former residents, now adults, many of them with children in their arms. Some cried, others smiled. Everyone looking at the statue felt they were looking at something that transcended time, as if Nieve were there, still watching, still protecting. Nieve's story began with abandonment, but it was never about that. It was about everything that came after, about the people who said yes when they could have turned their backs on her, about the strength that comes when someone believes in you. The applause grew slow, then louder, until it became a long, emotional round of applause. Pedro approached his brother and hugged him. "You said that very well, man." Juan smiled embarrassedly. But they both knew those words were more than just words. They were the essence of everything they had experienced. Nieve, even silently, had taught everyone how to make a difference. And now, it was their turn to continue the teaching, not with prepared lessons, but with the living example of what it means to love unconditionally. Over the years, the foundation snow spread to other states. The young people who grew up there opened branches in neighboring cities, carrying on the same spirit, welcoming with dignity, caring with presence, rebuilding with love. Pedro graduated as a psychologist and returned to work with children who had experienced traumas similar to his own. Juan became an illustrator and educator, creating art workshops for children, helping them tell their stories with color. Clara, now with white hair, continued as a counselor, and the heart of the original home. Maria retired, but visited us often, bringing cookies and long hugs. And in every corner of the foundation, Snow's presence was felt, in the photos, on the painted walls, in the memories that kept flooding back. One day, a little girl who had just arrived at the foundation asked where the white horse was. She was told that Nieve had been gone for a long time, but that there he still lived on in everyone. She frowned and replied, "But I saw him in my dream last night. He said everything was going to be okay." Everyone smiled. Juan bent down and asked, "And what else did he say?" The girl thought for a second and replied, "He called me brave." Pedro, watching from afar, closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It wasn't the first time a child had reported something like this. And that was enough, because Nieve somehow was still there, maybe not in the flesh, but in spirit, in the courage he aroused, in the comfort he still offered. Like every true guardian, he never truly left. Nieve's portrait in the center, surrounded by the faces of children of all ages, colors, and backgrounds. Above, a phrase read, "Sometimes, love doesn't have a voice, but it does have a voice." Firm steps. The mural became a landmark in the city, visited by schools, tourists, and even pilgrims. But more than a beautiful place, it was a constant reminder of what had been built there, a space where the impossible became reality because someone, a horse, a mother, an elderly person, an entire community, decided not to give up. Clara, sitting alone on the porch one night, looked out at the field where it all began. The full moon illuminated the wooden cross, the Joaquín tree, and the statue of Snow. "You would be proud, my friend," she whispered. She didn't expect a reply, but the wind blew, softly, like a caress. She closed her eyes and smiled. That story, which began on an empty road and with cruel abandon, had become a beacon for many. And to think it all began with two barefoot children and a horse that chose not to ignore it. Clara knew life would still have challenges, but she also knew there was now a net, a force, an invisible but indestructible heritage. And so she slept peacefully, because where there had once been despair, there was now hope. At the local public school, a new literature teacher asked students to write about what a true hero was. Among the texts submitted, one written by a 10-year-old girl caught our attention. She wrote about a white horse that couldn't fly, speak, or wear a cape, but who saved lives with its presence. The text circulated on social media, shared by educators, artists, and even authorities. Clara read it silently with tears in her eyes. It was further confirmation that history lived on, shaping thoughts and inspiring new generations. And just like that girl, hundreds of other children came to understand that courage doesn't have just one form. Sometimes it has calm eyes, steady legs, and an instinct that recognizes pain before words. Pedro and Juan, now adults, officially assumed the coordination of the foundation. Clara watched them with silent pride, knowing that the time had come to simply follow them. The children who were once abandoned now guided the future of dozens of others. Every decision they made bore the mark of what they had experienced and what they had learned from Nieve, from Joaquín, from their own mother. They kept the spirit of the house intact, to welcome, to protect, to transform. During an internal assembly, Pedro said, "We are not an institution, we are a growing family." And everyone agreed, because in that place, more than roles and rules, what kept everything running was love. And love, as everyone knew, was the most valuable legacy Nieve had left. An Argentine documentary filmmaker heard the story and asked permission to record the foundation's journey and its protagonists. For months, he recorded interviews, captured scenes of everyday life, and visited symbolic places. The road where it all began, Joaquín's house and Nieve's tree and cross. The film, titled The Silent Guardian, premiered at an international festival and moved audiences around the world. It has received awards, translations, and rave reviews. But for Pedro, Juan, and Clara, the most important thing was its local impact. Children who were once afraid to talk about their pain are now raising their hands to tell their stories. And that, more than any recognition, was the greatest victory, transforming silence into voice. With the success of the documentary came invitations, interviews, and trips. But the brothers turned down most of them. "We want to keep our feet here, on the land where it all began," said Juan. Still, they knew the story must keep traveling. So, they authorized the creation of a traveling educational project called Asas de Nieve, which brought art workshops, conversation circles, and storytelling to remote regions. Pedro coordinated the team remotely, and once a month personally visited one of the communities served. On one of these trips, a boy hugged him and said, "You're the boy on the horse." He smiled and replied, "Actually, the horse was mine." And in that look between them, there was something greater than gratitude. There was continuity. A grand celebration was held for the 20th anniversary of its founding. Former residents returned with their families, and old volunteers appeared with teary eyes and stories to tell. Clara, now with deep wrinkles and a serene smile, was honored with a wooden bench beneath the mango tree, the place where she used to sit to see her children and remember Nieve. An engraved plaque read, "To those who turned abandonment into refuge." Pedro gave a short speech thanking everyone, but especially those who were no longer with us. Joaquín, Maria, Nieve. Juan projected a video with old photos, children's voices, and the image of a white horse running free through the field. No one held back their tears. That day didn't mark the end of a cycle, but rather the confirmation that the seed planted on that cold night had grown into a forest. The children who once arrived silently were now active voices in the world. Some became lawyers, teachers, artists, loving mothers and fathers, and purposeful citizens. All of us, without exception, carry within us the memory of a horse that appeared when no one else did. And although life went on, with joys, losses, and challenges, there was one thing that never changed: the commitment to continue, to be snow in someone's life, to never abandon, to see, to welcome, and to love. And this invisible pact between them all was the true miracle of the story. Years later, at a conference for social work students, Pedro was asked what the most important moment of his entire career was. He thought for a moment, looked at the silent audience, and replied, "It was then when Nieve stopped in front of us, on that road. I could have kept going, ignored it, carried on like so many do. But she stopped, and it all began there." The audience applauded, but more than the answer itself, it was the pause beforehand that remained in everyone's memory, because in that silence lay the true weight of transformation, the recognition that the simplest moments, a decision, a gesture, a presence, are those that most change destinies. Juan, in turn, decided to write a book for adults, different from the children's book he had illustrated in his youth. He called it "The Day the World Saw Us," and in it he narrated not only the events of that childhood marked by abandonment and salvation, but also the feelings, the emptiness, the reunions. The book became required reading in psychology and pedagogy faculties. He received messages from readers saying, "Now I understand my own past," or "Your horse made me believe again." But the greatest recognition came from Pedro, who, upon finishing the reading, said, "You managed to write what until now I had only felt." Juan smiled and replied, "It's because we carry this story together, brother. It will always be ours." And there, between pages and memories, Nieve remained alive, galloping between hearts that learned not to give up. In the field where it all began, the wooden cross stood firm, now surrounded by native flowers and the generous shade of the tree Joaquín had planted. Little children still asked who Nieve was, and the older ones said it with a twinkle in their eyes, as if they were discussing a true legend. Sometimes visitors left letters at the foot of the cross. Other times they just sat there in silence, because there was something about that place that needed no explanation. It was a kind of peace, an invisible presence that can only be felt where love has made its home. Clara still walked by there on special days. She would stay there for a few minutes, murmur a thank you, and return. It was her way of saying, "We continue," and somehow he always answered. Pedro and Juan decided to build a school alongside the foundation. A different kind of school, where empathy was as important as math, and where children learned from a young age to recognize the pain of others. They called it the Guardians Institute, in honor of all those who, like Nieve, dared to protect when no one else would. On the entrance wall, a phrase, "See, embrace, love." The first class had 30 students, some foster children, others from the community, all with something in common, the hope of growing up in a less indifferent world. And it was there, in the hallways filled with drawings and laughter, that the brothers understood. The mission continued, with new names, new faces, but the same essence. A legacy that is not limited to a story, because when life is touched by something so pure, it is never the same. Did you stay here? Prove it was worth it? Like, comment, or share? One morning, a little girl with curious eyes asked Juan if he really believed a horse could change the world. He leaned down, looked her straight in the eyes and said, "It's not the horse that changes the world, it's what it awakens in us." The answer seemed simple, but it stayed in the girl's mind for days. She told her classmates about it, wrote it down in her notebook, drew snow with golden wings, and without knowing it, she began her own inner revolution, because that's how everything worked there. One gesture generated another, which generated another, until it became a chain. There was no magic, there was choice. Choose to feel, to care, to never turn your face away. And it was this teaching, born of a silent animal, that kept everything standing. On the last page of the diary Clara had been writing since the day she was reunited with her children, there was a sentence. "Life hit me hard, but it was on the ground where I found who I truly was." She closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and smiled. He was tired, yes, but he was also whole. He had lived through what many hadn't. He had won where many had given up. And it all began with 2 children, abandoned by the side of the road, and a white horse that decided not to go any further. When asked if she believed in miracles, Clara replied, "I believe in the miracle of being seen," because in the end, that was what Nieve did, see. And in seeing, she had taught the world to love again. For Clara's 80th birthday, the foundation prepared a surprise celebration. There were balloons, cake, music, children running around, and in the center of the room, a large painting, a painting of snow under the moon, with Clara, a young woman, at its side holding her children's hands. She fell silent at that sight. Then she cried. Peter and John hugged her, and everyone present gave her a standing ovation, not because of her age, but because of everything she represented. That night, as she looked around, she realized it had been worth it. Every tear, every sleepless night, every battle, because that place, full of life, was the concrete answer to the pain of the past. A new world built from a gesture and a neigh that resonates to this day. Clara passed away a few months later, peacefully in her bed, surrounded by love. The entire city stopped to honor her. The funeral was held in the countryside, under the Joaquín tree, in front of Nieve's cross. It was as if everything came together again, tenderly closing the circle. Pedro and Juan, now grown men, promised to carry on, and they did. The foundation grew, the school multiplied its network, and Nieve's teachings continued to be passed down from generation to generation. It wasn't just a story of abandonment, of overcoming, or of justice. It was about what happens when someone chooses to see, choose to stay, choose to love. And so even without a voice, Nieve spoke louder than all, because sometimes the most human thing in history is precisely the one who wasn't human. Today, at the entrance of the foundation's snow, a new sign welcomes all who arrive. Here, begin your story. but you'll never be alone. Visitors from all over the world stop in front of it, take photos, but most of all, they feel it. They feel that this place is different. Snow doesn't appear so often in dreams anymore, but sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees, or when a child smiles for the first time in a long time, someone whispers, "It's still here," and it is. Because what it did, no one can ever erase. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a legend. It was pure love, a love so real it lasted decades, tore down walls, touched entire countries, and transformed lives. And that's why, even when eyes close and names are lost, this story continues. Because every time someone decides to care, decides to stay, decides to see, snow neighs somewhere, reminding that there is hope, always has been, and always will be. Send this story to someone who needs to be reminded that love still exists in the world.